You know, I've been watching American politics for a long time. I've been part of it, I've shaped some of it, and I've made my share of mistakes inside of it. But every now and then, something gets said from the highest office in this country that makes you stop what you're doing and think, did I hear that right? Because this past Friday, August 14th, at a police academy on Long Island, the President of the United States stood in front of a crowd of law enforcement officers and said with a chuckle that he would soon be declaring the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that sits between the coastlines of Iran and Oman, thousands of miles from our shores, a territory of the United States of America. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not just the words, but what they mean. Because there's a difference between projecting American strength, which every president has a duty to do, and saying something so disconnected from law, from history, from how the world actually works, that it undermines the very strength you're trying to project. And I want to walk you through this carefully because the details matter here. They always do. And there's something else happening inside the Republican Party right now. A fight between the president and his own Senate leader, John Thune, that connects to all of this in ways that I think are worth understanding. We'll come back to that in a moment. But first, let's talk about what's actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz, because you cannot evaluate what the president said unless you understand the ground truth. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Before this war began, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply and a significant share of natural gas and fertilizer moved through that passage every single day. We're talking about over 100 ships daily. It is bordered by Iran to the north and Oman and the UAE to the south. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which the international community treats as customary law, the strait is classified as an international waterway. Coastal states can claim territorial waters up to 12 nautical miles from shore, but ships of all nations have what's called transit passage, the right to move through without interference. Now, the United States never ratified UNCLOS. Neither did Iran. But here's the thing that matters. Both countries have historically operated as though its principles apply, because those principles are woven into how global commerce functions. This war, which started on February 28th, when the U.S. and Israel launched strikes against Iran, changed everything. Iran closed the strait to what it called unfriendly nations. The United States imposed its own naval blockade. And right now, traffic through that passage has dropped from over 100 ships a day to roughly 8. The Memorandum of Understanding signed in June, which was supposed to bring this conflict toward a resolution, is expiring this Sunday. And instead of focusing on how to get back to the negotiating table, the president is standing at a podium talking about planting an American flag on a waterway that belongs to the international community. And we'll get to why that matters so much. Now look, I understand the instinct behind strong rhetoric. When you're the President of the United States and you've got American naval forces deployed and you're running a blockade and the other side is firing on commercial ships, there's a temptation to speak in terms of dominance. And some people will tell you, some smart people, that this is just Trump being Trump. that it's rally talk, that it's designed for a domestic audience heading into the midterms. And I'll grant you this much. There is a political logic to projecting overwhelming strength when 60% of the American public, according to Quinnipiac, opposes this war. You want people to feel like you're winning, even if the situation on the ground is murky. I understand that instinct. But here's where I have to be honest with you. Understanding the instinct doesn't make the statement any less dangerous, because words from the President of the United States travel. They don't stay in that room on Long Island. They reach Tehran, where Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, responded within hours, saying the Strait has been Iranian, is Iranian, and will remain Iranian. They reach Oman, which shares sovereignty over that waterway and has been a quiet, essential mediator throughout this conflict. They reach our allies in Europe and Asia, who depend on that passage for energy and who are watching to see whether the United States still operates within the framework of international law. When you claim a waterway that legally belongs to no single nation, you don't project strength. You project something else entirely. You project a willingness to abandon the rules-based order that the United States spent 75 years building, and that is not a small thing. Let me tell you something from experience. When I was in the White House, we dealt with crises that tested every alliance we had. And one thing I learned the hard way sometimes is that the words a president uses in a moment of tension either open doors or close them. Right now, with that memorandum of understanding expiring on Sunday, August 17th, the door to diplomacy with Iran is not just closing, it's being bricked shut. And it's not just the Strait of Hormuz claim that concerns me. It's the pattern. Because while the president is making declarations about foreign waterways, he's simultaneously engaged in an extraordinary public attack on his own Senate Majority Leader. Now, I want to be fair about this, because there's a legitimate policy disagreement underneath it, even if I disagree with the policy itself. The Save America Act, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, would require proof of citizenship to register to vote and photo ID at the polls. Supporters say it's common sense, that it protects election integrity. And I'll say this, the principle that only citizens should vote in federal elections is not controversial. Nobody disagrees with that. But the question isn't about the principle. The question is about what happens in practice when you impose these requirements on a country where, according to the Brennan Center, over 21 million Americans of voting age cannot quickly locate documents like a birth certificate or a passport. That's not a small number. And the people most affected tend to be older Americans, rural voters, people who've changed their names, often women after marriage, and lower income citizens. Here's where this gets tangled. President Trump didn't just ask Thune to pass this bill. He publicly humiliated him. He went on Truth Social and said, and I'll paraphrase, that Thune shouldn't let the Senate leave town, that he should terminate the filibuster, and that Democrats couldn't believe how lucky they got with this Senate leadership. He said, and this is a quote I want to be careful with, that stupidity always brings losing and death. Now, Thune's position, and this is where I think people need to pay attention, is actually the constitutionally responsible one, even though I disagree with the underlying bill. Thune has said multiple times that the votes simply aren't there. The bill has failed 5 times to get simple majority support, let alone 60 votes. Senator Cornyn called canceling recess over it an act of futility. Thune himself asked the question that every honest leader should ask: show me how this ends. What is the picture of victory? And you know what? That's not weakness. That's a Senate leader doing basic math and trying to use the chamber's time responsibly. Meanwhile, Senator Mike Lee is leading a group of about 14 senators demanding recess be canceled, threatening to force roll call votes, posting on social media, "Do not assume you have my consent. You do not." And Trump is amplifying all of it, turning what should be an internal legislative strategy conversation into a public loyalty test. And this is the part that worries me most about our democratic ecosystem, because what you're watching is not a policy debate. It's something else. It's the systematic erosion of the idea that a co-equal branch of government can exercise independent judgment. When a president publicly attacks his own party's Senate leader for doing arithmetic, for acknowledging that 53 seats cannot overcome a 60-vote threshold, what message does that send to every other Republican senator, especially the ones in competitive races who need August recess to campaign, to meet constituents, to respond to local emergencies? Senator Capito from West Virginia was literally inspecting flood damage in her state. Senator Tillis said members need to be in their home states, not doing what he called performative politics. And they're right. The August recess isn't a vacation. It's how a representative democracy stays connected to the people it serves. But the pressure campaign doesn't care about that. It cares about compliance. And when you combine that with a president who in the same week declares a foreign waterway American territory and demands his own Senate leader destroy a 200-year-old procedural protection in the filibuster, you start to see a pattern. It's not about this bill or that bill. It's about whether the institutions that check presidential power are allowed to function. So let me tell you what I think happens from here. And I want to be measured about this, because nobody has a crystal ball. On the Strait of Hormuz, the claim is not going to go anywhere legally. A presidential declaration does not change international law. Military control during a conflict is not sovereignty. The United States doesn't gain territorial rights over a waterway because it has ships stationed there, any more than Iran gained sovereignty over it by closing it. What this claim does practically is make negotiations harder. Oman, which shares jurisdiction over the strait, now has to weigh whether mediation puts it in a position of appearing to legitimize an American territorial claim on its own coastline. Our European and Asian allies have to calculate whether supporting U.S. positions in the region means endorsing a doctrine of conquest over international waterways. And Iran, which was already calling Trump's statements nonsense, now has even less domestic political space to return to the table. On the Senate fight, Thune, Lee, and the White House did reach a partial deal in early August to vote on a standalone voter ID provision while postponing the full budget resolution until after recess. That's the kind of pragmatic compromise that actually reflects how the Senate is supposed to work. But the damage to the relationship between the White House and Senate leadership is real, and it compounds with every public attack. If Republicans lose the midterms, and the polls suggest that is a real possibility, part of the reason will be that vulnerable senators spent August defending themselves against their own president rather than connecting with voters. And this is where I want to end, because I think it's the most important part. The United States of America is not a country that acquires territory through blockades. It's not a country that bullies its own legislators into abandoning the constitutional process. It's not a country that makes it harder for its own citizens to vote in order to solve a problem, non-citizen voting at scale, that every serious study has shown barely exists. We are, at our best, a country that leads through the power of our example. We built the international order. We wrote the rules. We convinced the world that democracy and the rule of law weren't just American ideas, they were universal principles worth defending. And every time we walk away from those principles, whether it's claiming someone else's waterway or attacking our own legislative leaders for counting votes, we make the world a little less safe and our democracy a little more fragile. Now, I've lived long enough to know that America has an extraordinary capacity to correct course. We've done it before, we'll do it again. But correction doesn't happen by accident. It happens because citizens pay attention, because they understand what's at stake, and because they demand better from the people they put in office. The Strait of Hormuz does not belong to us. The Senate does not belong to the President. And the right to vote does not belong to only those Americans fortunate enough to have their paperwork in perfect order. These are not partisan statements. These are the foundations of what it means to be a constitutional republic. And I'll tell you this much, if we forget that, we won't have to worry about what Iran does or what any other country does, because we'll have already done the damage to ourselves.